Okay, well, thanks for coming. This is lecture number 5. We're going to move into a new area of integration. And remember, my approach is a little bit different from the book that I've suggested you buy. The book is really good for institutions and description of the European, the operationalization of the European integration process, and not necessarily the theory that I'm pushing. My approach has been to focus on factor allocations and their role in driving integration, and this is also true of trade. So the idea here will see in what sense can trade integration contribute to an efficient outcome in the sense that we learned at the very beginning of the course, or to a convergence of wages across regions, right? So we already understood from the Edgeworth box that if enough people or capital move, that wages will converge in a regional integration process when the production functions are kind of similar. That's what the EU is trying to do. They're trying to give you this similar production function across regions. It's wonderful. But on the other hand, we might not have to do all that hard work because moving people and capital is painful and costly. So maybe trade can substitute for the mobility of factors. So that's a magic idea that Robert Mundell, among other things, pushed a long time ago. The idea that trade can be a substitute for factor mobility. You don't have to move the people and the capital, you just can move the goods. But that's not an unequivocal and unconditional statement. It actually depends on a bunch of stuff. Economic theory is pretty clear on this, and it's pretty robust theory. So I'll try to give you a very broad brush stroke picture of this state of trade theory. Maybe I can just make a survey. Who's taking trade? Who took trade theory from Kamika? Uli Kamika? Okay, so you have some of this will be familiar to you if you've had trade courses in your previous existence. That's great. If not, again, my objective is to show you that trade is really just applied microeconomics. But you got to put your thinking cap on. You got to think hard to get it right. So today's lecture, quick review of last time. We'll talk about general ideas of international trade. So remember, we're in one country, one region. There's a bunch of people in the other region, and for some reason we swap goods, and we like to do that. We feel like it's good for us. And the question is, who is it good for, and under what conditions can we say that that's always going to be a good thing? Might not be always a good thing for everybody. I'll review the stuff that we already talked about and maybe didn't talk about enough. We'll talk about isocost curves as an extension of this notion of duality theory of production. The primal approach is the isoquant. How much do I need to produce a unit of output? The isocost curve is how can I efficiently produce one unit of good and distribute the factors to the factors of production in a constant returns world. So that's a different approach. It's called the dual. It's really a cost minimization approach. If I have to pay labor a certain wage and I have to produce one unit of good, what is the most efficient way of producing that good and paying the rest to the other factor of production? So that'll give us another curve that looks like an isoquant. And it'll give us some interesting insights into understanding today's lecture, which is why trade can be good for you, and it can achieve integration between Poland and Germany, or Finland and Poland, even though the capital and the labor differences are not equalized through mobility. Okay? So this will give us some interesting results. One is called the Rybczynski theorem. You get a bonus point for being able to spell that on the exam. A famous Polish economist who pioneered this idea, although it can be seen in other places as well. And the idea of the so-called Stolper-Samuelson or factor price equalization theorem, which is basically the idea that if we get trade going and under certain conditions, labor remuneration in the two regions will converge, the rate of return on capital will converge, even though the capital and labor aren't in motion, they're not moving. So that's really a fascinating, not necessarily universal result, but one that we'd like to care about, right? So quickly, last time we talked about labor moving, so that we learned that's quite a big decision in people's lives. A lot of people have moved and will move and are thinking about moving. That has consequence for the receiving country as well as, or the region, as well as the donor region or the sending region. We looked at the microeconomics of investment in human capital as one perspective of migration. So you're investing in your future by putting yourself in a different environment, and under certain conditions that can be a really profitable thing. Under certain conditions it's not so interesting and you don't do it. And that curve or that valuation function, that kinked valuation function, is a very useful object for you in your future. If you don't go into economics as a profession, but maybe as an applied field, if you work for a ministry, it's a great way to think about when you have to pay something up front, what is it worth to you, and what can drive you to take that decision. And we talked about migration in practice as well. We saw that migration is certainly increasing within Europe, but it's not as much as people would have you believe. It's still quite modest. Interestingly, young people are more mobile. We saw that in the East German, West German integration process. We see it today. After the crises in Spain and Portugal and Greece, a lot of young people came north. A lot of people came to Berlin. That's why. But these people tend to go where the future is, and sometimes the future is back home. So we see a lot of reverse migration, also part of the story. So fascinating set of ideas to apply also to your own personal lives. Some of you may be going somewhere after you finish your degree here in Berlin. Okay, so I'd like to just discuss briefly which one of these mechanisms we've discussed until now, and the one we're going to discuss today, is the most rapid. Well, we learned, that this one is very slow. The solo process is kind of the slow grinding process. Somebody sent me an email on Moodle, and I responded in detail about that. You should understand that the rate of convergence assumes that there are different rates of growth, and that leads to a convergence almost mechanically. And we can use the rule of 70 or 69 to figure that out. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look at your Moodle page and look at my response, okay? And Berfien also was clear on that. This is a slow process. This is why Robert Barrow in 1991 predicted that East Germany would require 35 years to close half of the gap to West Germany. And he was wrong, okay? Because within 10 years, that gap was closed much more than half. But since then, it's been very slow, okay? So in some sense, the solo model is this backdrop of convergence, and trade, mobility of factors, can accelerate that rate, but need not do it forever. So eventually people stop moving, and a lot of the immigration encounters resistance and capital mobility. People begin to take a bit more of a cautious view on moving machines and means of production, and eventually this will slow down the rate of convergence, and that's kind of what we've seen in the case of East Germany and West Germany. Okay, we still have this residual gap in labor productivity between the two regions. Okay, so we know these three, and then we're going to learn today about this one. And the question is, which one is faster? Right? Well, it's clear, or which one is the fastest? Well, it's clear that if you watched Germany integrate in 1990, 91, people were trading like crazy. Entrepreneurs from the West were driving trucks to East Germany and just selling stuff on the streets, right? Fantastic. I mean, a lot of East Germans were moving to West Germany, but by no means the intensity of the process that we observed here. And the same thing is true of Eastern Europe. When the wall came down, when the state planning regimes in the East were sort of were toppled. So the trade in goods and services is really the most rapid process. That's the one, if the borders are open, if you have free trade, and we have free trade within Europe, we have standards to obey, but we do have something like free trade, we're going to see something. So this integration process is going to be really in the first instance about trade. And that's why the European Union is so important. The European Union is a trading union. It's a customs union. The idea is to reduce barriers to trade, make it easy for you to go sell your stuff in Poland and for Polish people to come sell their stuff here, right? So that's easy to understand. So this is going to be a very powerful driving force to understand this, what we see here in this picture, which is kind of the concentration of economic activity as evidenced by light This is a wonderful set of studies that have been done in the past 15 years looking at understanding economic growth. If you look at a picture of North Korea, it's completely dark, and then South Korea is totally lit up. Now, you might call that light pollution. It is, but it certainly is an indicator, a signal of economic activity. You can also use this to find out where the underground economy is. Okay, so if you have a really good satellite, you can hone in on Italy, and you can find some really interesting spots there where, hey, there's not supposed to be anything going on here, but there's a lot of electricity being used. There must be something going on. So let's talk about integration by trade. We're going to talk about mechanisms that allow these two regions, Finland and Poland, to somehow attain an efficient allocation without moving a single person or a single machine. All right? So the idea is, how does that happen? Goods market integration. Call that trade. And we're going to talk about it in the context of two regions that cannot set the price of the goods that they're selling. So there's a world out there that presents a price vector to them, and then they basically will trade with each other. And you can see that it's a supply story. It's a supply-side driven story. I will produce the good at which I'm more efficiently able to produce. And if there are two goods out there, it's a different story than just one good. So the key aspect of this story will have to be at least two goods. We're not talking about GDP anymore. We're talking about, stuff, cloth, and autos, cars. Okay? That's two possibilities. And the question is, what's the distinguishing factor? Well, those are not the same good. People have tastes, and maybe they prefer having clothes as opposed to a car, or a car preferable to clothes. We need something that drives trade, that drives two regions to be able to exchange with other, maybe because they could produce a lot of one and not so much of the other. That's one obvious reason. And there are many ways of thinking about this. We don't have to talk about the one that I'm going to talk about mostly today, which involves this sort of factor intensity trade, driven by the fact that Poland, in this example, is labor intensive or labor rich, and Finland is capital rich. That's the interesting sort of position, the starting point of this analysis. Let me just give you some data to make sure you understand this is a really important aspect, especially within the EU, because it's all about within the EU. This is before Brexit, so this is until the UK dropped off the map. You can see that there was a big drop in the financial crisis period, 2008 to 2010, but there's a trend that's unavoidably evident in this picture, and if you take the UK out, you'll see something very interesting. This is showing basically the volume of exports of EU countries to other EU countries, okay? Intra-EU trade. Now, here's the question. What do you think is going to happen when we kick Britain out, or when Britain decides to leave? Is it going to go up or go down? It's not really clear, right? Because people in the UK were saying, there's a lot of trade diversion. Maybe this is not natural. Maybe the EU is creating lots of barriers to importing goods from third countries like Australia, or from Canada, or from India. Right? That's the argument that went on in Britain. What do you think is going to happen after Brexit occurs? Again, we're not looking at the UK. The UK is a very interesting story, and you'll hear about that next week when we have our guest speaker from Ireland, or speakers. Two people from the Republic of Ireland's embassy are going to come talk to us about their perspective in terms of vis-a-vis Britain, because they were big trading partners with Britain, still are, but that's changed a lot too. So what do you expect, up or down? That was my expectation too, okay? Now, I wouldn't be showing this to you unless I was really surprised, okay? But it could go down, and I could go up. What do you think? Go ahead.
It could also be possible that because of new trade barriers after the Brexit, EU countries substitute the imports or exports from into UK with exports and
and they may be cutting the prices. You know, there may be other things going on. Anyway, the shock is there was a drop because of the pandemic, but then it shot up like crazy. And this is volume, okay? This is not dividing by GDP. Well, I'm going to do that in a second. So it's quite an impressive increase in this so in other words, the Brexit seems to have accelerated intra-European integration. And there are lots of stories we can tell. Maybe we'll tell some today, okay? So kind of surprising to me. I'm sure that if you do this for the UK, it doesn't look like this. In fact, their economy has shrunk overall. There's a lot of studies that have concluded that the UK has maybe lost 5% of GDP off from trend by leaving the European Union. So it's like, you know, you take off your hand, take off your arm, you kind of still feel that it's there, but it's not there anymore, yeah.
But there are different factors that could have played a role there. The period between 2020 and 2022, there were also problems with supply chains.
Exactly.
China, so I would assume that
Good point.
were substituted by goods from inside Europe, which would have been
Would have helped everybody. Right, exactly. So again, in macro, you always understand. Macro means looking at everything, and you're going to have all sorts of confounding influences. That's right. Okay, so what I'm doing is a bit unfair in the sense I'm not telling you all the other stories, but we do see the supply chain disruption, the big drop, that's the pandemic, and then this persistent problem with Chinese and Asian supply chains and even the United States. So this is not a conclusive story, but it's an interesting story for a study. The first thing you should do by objecting to this is saying, why are you looking at absolute numbers? You should divide by GDP, and that's correct, okay? So when you do that, you still get the increase. So given GDP, exports have become more important for Europe. Fascinating outcome. So, you know, maybe it's not permanent. Maybe when we get the supply chains going, I'm a bit skeptical because China and the Asian theater are becoming more resistant to further integration. Let's put it that way. Put it neutrally. But in any case, the world is a complex place. No question about it. So let's look at individual countries just for information. Germany, no-brainer. It's the biggest exporter of goods within the EU. Now 27, we've kicked the Brits out. Okay, so this is really recent data. Okay, it's not surprising, it's a big country, so you have to divide by GDP. Again, good news for you guys to learn that, because if you don't scale by GDP, you're kind of cheating. The United States has a huge national debt. It's also a huge country, so you have to divide by GDP. So when you do that, but just take a look at this, you see that, you know, the small countries are on the right. It's not surprising. There are some small countries on the right that are actually too small. And one of those is Greece, for example. Greece is not open enough. It's not exporting enough given its fighting weight. So if you divide by GDP, you see exactly what I'm telling you. In fact, on goods, you see that France is on the right-hand side. So the French are not really big exporters of goods anymore. Germany's in kind of the gute Mittelfeld with Spain and Romania and Denmark. And the small countries are quite open, right? So Slovakia, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Czech Republic. That's being an open economy. So we're talking about, in the trade analysis I'll give you, we're talking about small open economies that don't have much influence on the price of the stuff they sell. They're price takers, right? And those left-hand countries are kind of good proxies for regional integration examples, like the Czech Republic integrating with Bavaria, or, you know, Finland with Poland. Okay, so who wants to complain about this picture? What's wrong with looking at goods? Yeah, what are services? What are services? Okay, keep going?
Well, a lot of services are not tradable, right? But there are tradable services.
Yeah, this is obviously tradable services, otherwise it wouldn't be in the trade statistics. So it's whatever we can write down that involves non-goods exchange. It could be banking. He said financial service could be insurance. It could be consulting. It could be the right to use a copyright or a trademark or something like that. There's a lot in there. So again, dividing by GDP, you see, I mean, if you look at this carefully, you see there's a lot of services. I mean, you just look at the numbers, these are raw numbers are quite large. Germany is also a big exporter of services. So if Germany exports a crane to a country, then it exports all the service contracts to take care of it. Germany exports a lot of printing machines, even though we don't use newspapers much, to America, because America still uses a lot of newspapers. And they also export the service contracts to take care of those printers, which are very expensive, those printing machines. So, and if you divide by GDP, you see that then it gets really interesting. Germany is down the bottom. It's a big country, not exporting as much as say, some of these small countries. So it's no longer in the middle Fed. It's kind of the back end. Italy is way at the bottom, and France, because services are difficult to export. You really have to have a good brand, like the UK. So if you calculate this with the UK in 2020, UK is way up there because they're exporting a lot of insurance, a lot of intangible services. Okay? Now, the world is globalizing. We all talk about globalization. If you look at the most recent years, it's gone down. So there has been a drop. But this is the trend. So it's not really fair for me to talk just about Europe globalizing with itself, integrating with itself, because this general trend is happening. Okay? So if you look at the, you always have to look at relatives. And if you look at EU trade relative to trade across the world, the global rate of growth in trade has slowed down, and we're seeing this increase in trade integration in Europe means that actually Europe is becoming more and more closely knit. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing is true if you look at the states of the United States or the countries of Asia, because the supply chain issue has forced regions to become more self-sufficient, either as a market process or as a process of policy. Okay. At the same time, we also have, and we won't talk about this until later on in the course, we have possibilities for intertemporal trade. So if a country exports more than it imports, is it saving or is it dissaving? If you think about goods and services together, if a country is, we say it's running a current account surplus, what do you think? Yeah, it's saving, it's accumulating, because it's not going to do this for free. You know, if German companies export a lot of cars to the rest of the world, it better be getting something for that. Claims on those countries, bank accounts, maybe owning pieces of those companies that are operating in the foreign countries, or maybe buying international debt, whatever. But that acquisition of financial assets is the counterpart. It's the bookkeeping counterpart, counter entry. So it means that Germans are saving vis-a-vis the rest of the world. If a country's in deficit, it means it's kind of borrowing or it's selling assets on net to enable it to import more goods and services than it exports. That means it's dissaving. And it could be doing it for a good reason, right? So if Poland is, we already learned about Poland trying to get some capital mobility, when Poland is getting a lot of machines from Germany and paying for them with loans vis-a-vis German banks or German savers, then obviously Poland is going to be in deficit. And if you look at the data, you see exactly that. Okay? And again, this is dividing by GDP. That's a big deficit, and it's not a bad deficit if the Poles are investing and not just consuming a lot, because they could be just consuming a lot, right? So you really have to, analysts would have to look at that very carefully. Okay, so overall we see that the percentage of this in this globalization process, things are becoming more intense, and we see very high shares of exports relative to total exports in the EU. So, the fraction of exports of Croatia that are as a component of their total exports is also very high. So Europe is really becoming kind of invested in itself, hopefully not in a risky way, but as we've seen in the past, especially with respect to energy, it wouldn't be such a bad idea to be more self-sufficient. Okay. This is another nice picture of the EU relative to other countries. So you can see the United States has also participated in this growing export boom of the EU as the target. Of course, China has also risen, but it's also tapered off in the past, say, three years. These are processes that also influence policy. Same is true of imports. Now I'd like to get into one example that's going to help influence our thought for the rest of this lecture, which is Germany and Poland. So these are like two, I would say, smaller countries. Germany's a big country, but in the world trading system, it's probably a small player, believe it or not. It has special products, but in the sense of these categories, Germany is not setting the price of meat or the price of grain or the price of inorganic chemicals taken as a whole. You know, maybe there's some specialized stuff, but overall, if you take these general categories, we can compute price indices for them, you see that, first off, there's a lot of trade going on. Okay, so if the number in the table is positive, Germany has a surplus with Poland, and if it's negative, Germany has a deficit. So starting in 1995, when we get some nice data from this bilateral trade business, you can see that the Germans had a deficit in meat. Okay. It's okay. Wurst is Wurst. I'm sure the meat inspectors will make sure that the quality is there. Slight surplus in dairy. Okay. I don't know if you use milk in your coffee, but chances are in 1995 it came from Brandenburg. That was not the case in 2020. So the dairy business has moved to Poland, okay? And Germany is buying dairy stuff. The same thing is true of grain. This kind of surprised me. Big deficit on grain, okay? On the other hand, if you look at chemicals, and again, this is taken crudely, big surplus. Pharmaceuticals, really big surplus. Maybe that's not so surprising to some of you, just kind of read the paper. If you extend this analysis to others, you see that, okay, so plastics, big surplus, all right, that sounds like chemicals. And then you've got wood products, deficit, persistent deficit. Wood products is furniture, right? And paper type of products, clothing, slight surplus in 2015, but it's gone back into deficit. Steel, iron. Can you see a pattern? Can you see a pattern emerging? Electronics is a deficit. It's also interesting. So it's going to be a difficult story to tell. I'm going to try to tell it. But if you look at furniture, big deficit. So what do we know about making furniture? Have you ever been to a furniture factory? Okay, maybe we should go to a furniture factory. Has anyone ever been to a chemical factory? Okay, so what could be the distinguishing factor between chemicals and, yeah?
The chemical factory is capital intensive.
Yeah, big time. Okay.
The furniture factory probably labor intensive, and there's more cheap labor in Poland.
Labor is more abundant. Remember, we're going to be looking from the factor supply perspective, but the outcome will be at the outset, labor is cheaper, right? But labor is abundant, and therefore, it's kind of relatively cheaper in terms of the two factor prices. That's exactly what we're going to be going for. So you can tell a nice story for almost everything here. Aluminum, it's a bit tricky because aluminum is also capital intensive, but it's also energy intensive, and German energy is expensive. Okay, so to do the whole story, you need three factors. You need to think about energy too. But we're going to stick to the production function with value added being an outcome of capital and labor inputs for the first instance. Yeah? Yeah.
But I learned in international trade that now a lot of capital-intensive products are still produced in lower income countries, which is still cheaper. Like, for example, aluminium.
And that's because energy is cheaper in those countries, and capital and energy are complements. You can't substitute them. They have to be put into use at the same time. So that's one cheap explanation. Again, we're talking about regional integration, so you can assume that the price of energy has a role here, but it's not a very big role. What's really a big role is the relative abundance of labor in the first instance. That's where we're going to be kind of coming from. So if you look at all these categories, you get this kind of common theme. Capital-intensive goods are more and more produced in Germany, and labor-intensive goods more and more frequently in Poland. That doesn't have to go on forever, because Germany and Poland will eventually, for reasons we discussed, will converge in terms of capital intensity, and then we'll be looking like, the Poles will look like us, basically. But until we get there, trade in goods could, in fact, substitute for this mobility. Okay, so again, the most impressive one for me is furniture, and interestingly, electronics. Okay, so I have a story for that as well. The components don't come from Poland. The components come from China. What you need to do electronics is people putting stuff together. That's very labor intensive. It's very expensive to have machines put together a coffee machine. It's very easy to have people put together a coffee machine. So again, this is a dynamic process. Maybe in 10 years or 20 years, my statement will not be so accurate, because the wages in Poland will have risen and made it more profitable to use a machine like they do in Germany to do those things. Okay? So again, you see this. Okay, so here's the final question. Who is winning? I mean, Trump used to always say, we're not winning, which is garbage if you think about it, but it's an interesting idea, because a lot of people say, oh, if we're running a trade surplus, we must be winning, right? That's kind of a limited idea. It means we're saving vis-a-vis the other guys, but hopefully we'll have something to spend our money on when it comes time. Otherwise, we're just playing a mercantilist game. So who's going to be, who's the winner? The question is, what is the overall bilateral balance? We have all these different bilateral goods-specific balances, but we have to add them all up and ask, what is the story between Germany and Poland in 2020 on trade in goods? All the stuff that I showed you, plus some other stuff that wasn't mentioned. What do you think? I mean, it looked like Germany was really kicking booty for the chemicals, but it was losing on the losing. We're all gaining because we have cheaper goods, and basically that's the bottom line. But if you add them all up, do you expect a deficit or a surplus? Exactly. That was my expectation. But it's wrong. Because Germany on the goods account was in deficit in 2020. So you really don't know. In fact, the model we're going to look at in this, we're just going to assume balanced trade. It's kind of a big surprise. Germany has huge comparative advantage in some products, has huge surpluses, and others it's importing like crazy. A lot of times Germany imports the raw materials, puts them together, and exports it back to where it came from, because maybe the fancy machine is in Germany, right? So you have what's called, it looks almost like intra-industry trade, but we're talking about these broad categories. We'll come back to so-called intra-industry trade in a second. So it's kind of a surprise, and we need to think about international trade in very, very broad terms, because there's a lot of stuff going on. First off, we should all write down it's voluntary. No one's forcing the Poles to trade with us here. No one's forcing the Finns to trade with the Poles. It's voluntary trade in the sense that the person or the individual who's selling is voluntarily selling, and the person who's buying is also voluntarily buying, because both those individuals think there's a profit opportunity involved, right? This is not a colonial setup. Now we're going to assume full employment, so that's going to take care of the issue of okay, we know that maybe labor markets aren't always in full employment, but we have this feeling that if there's a lot of labor around relative to capital, we have a capital abundant situation, and that would imply that in a market clearing setup, the wages would be lower and the return on capital would be higher. So that's just common economic sense. We're going to assume that. We'll come back to structural unemployment in another lecture, because that's a very important reason why globalization and integration actually run into roadblocks, because political parties say, we don't like this, we're not benefiting from trade. But in the first instance, we're going to talk about trade as basically as a full employment benchmark. And then the question is, what are the consequences? The impact of trade will be a convergence of prices of factors across the regions. And that's a special type of trade. So I'm going to talk about various types of trade. This is going to be our objective, but that's only one facet of the three types of trade we'll consider. Okay, so voluntary trade, it's about consumer surplus. I'm going to suppress this little show. I'll give it to you on the Moodle page. Think about the demand curve and the supply curve. Think where they cross. Think of a price that's above that point. Okay, if that price is above the intersection of the willingness to pay and the willingness to supply of the participants in the market, that means we have an inefficiency. And you can think about opening up to trade means that we're currently producing and consuming goods at a price that is not really consistent with an equilibrium formed by the union of those two regions. Okay, so that's kind of the verbal aspect. So we're going to be talking about consumer surplus, the area under the demand curve that increases as a result of prices coming down. So when we start trading with the poles, one of the things you're going to notice is the price of the stuff that we buy here will go down. And that makes everybody happy. Think about beer. Okay? So I don't know about you, but I think about beer sometimes. And when you think about what happened after Germany started to integrate with Eastern Europe, was the price of competitor products in the beer sector were cheaper than the stuff that we were buying here. Now, of course, you might say, well, our beer is better. If it has comparable quality, it was cheaper. Okay, so a person like a student doesn't have so much money would consider maybe buying Lech instead of buying, the HB Augustina Boy. Okay, so there's a huge difference. In 1995, there's a huge difference in those prices. It was like, maybe $1.50 a bottle versus €3 a bottle. I'm exaggerating a little bit. So that's going to cause the price to come down because producers in Germany will have to compete. Price will come down. So if you don't like to think about beer, think about something else. Think about the price of bread. Okay, a lot of bread is actually produced over there now and brought over here. It's cheaper. So people love cheap prices. They love when prices go down. Your consumer surplus increases. That's always good. On the other hand, it may mean that there's some losers. So if you're producing the beer here and you see the price going down, if you're producing the bread here and you see the price go down, doesn't make you so happy. So you're kind of losing. You may be consuming the bread, maybe consuming the beer, but you're also working in the sector that was producing these goods, and that's not so great. Okay, so it's not necessarily a win-win for everybody, and that's why we have to consider the supply side. The supply side involves producer surplus. Right? So I'm not going to show you the picture. Berfin will show you the picture. It's very easy. It's this, right? And the equilibrium price is above. And I just have too many slides today. I'm not going to show you this. But when the price comes down for the consumer, it's good. When it comes down for the producer, it's not so good. And for the Polish producer who's producing the beer or the bread, the price goes up. It goes up. So it's good for them. And that's why producers in Poland are going to be happy. And that's why trade is taking place, because these prices are attractive to people over here. So that means that prices over there rise, which is going to be great for the producers. Now the consumers may not be so happy. The Polish consumers may say, gee, all this beer is going to Germany. This is terrible. You can prove that consumer surplus actually, the total of consumer and producer surplus increases, but you have to distribute it because the Polish producers will win and the German consumers will win, okay? And somehow you have to compensate the losers, and sometimes we don't do that. We don't do that enough. Maybe you have to do that using taxes and redistribution. But in any case, increasing trade increases competition, okay? So the common price between Poland and Germany will be somewhere between the price in Germany and the price in Poland. Okay? So that means the producer surplus will fall here, it will rise over there, and I'm not going to show you the slides. You can look at them. They're in the book, in the Baldwin-Wiplow's book. Okay, and this means basically that there'll be pressure to reallocate factors because, as you'll see in a second, factor prices will change. And that will cause people to say, Polish people will say, wow, there's profit to be made in the beer industry. Maybe we should migrate over there and leave the sectors that are less competitive, okay, in a way that we'll discuss in detail. So, and again, assuming full employment, we can trace these processes very clearly. So I'm going to talk about that in detail. And you know, prices in economics mean not necessarily only the cost of production. It's the willingness to pay. That's what makes neoclassical economics so flexible. It's about the cost of producing, that's the supply curve, and it's also the willingness to pay, which is the demand curve, right? So if you're interested in this, we need to consider the effects of, you know, getting rid of the barriers to trade. So before Poland joined the EU, there were tariffs on European products, Western European products, and the European Union had a common external tariff on Polish goods. So integrating Germany and Poland means getting rid of those tariffs. The prices are allowed to converge, and for reasons we already said, there was no trade before. There's suddenly trade. These prices are going to be different. There's going to be a real gain from trade. That's the idea. Now, as I said already, and I'll repeat it many times, this assumes, and you will have losers from trade. You have to compensate the losers. And because consumer prices falling is good for everybody, people love it. But if you're in a country like Poland where prices were rising after trade integration, there may be some resistance. People may say, hey, look, you know, I like being in the EU, I like being a European, I still have my job, but the price of everything I buy is going up, right? How do you deal with that? Well, one way is that the European Union transfers money to Poland and bribes them, okay? It's the same part of the same mechanism, because the value-added tax raises money that makes it possible to offer those compensations. A lot of people say bribe. I prefer to say compensation, okay? So, you know, again, understanding the political economy is part of understanding the European Union. It's about compensating the losers. And a lot of people forget to talk about that. So let's go back to our basic trade theory. There are three types of international trade. There's Ricardian trade, and that's the one that everyone learns when you first start your first encounter with economics. Comparative advantage. And that's something every economist should remember, right? There's a difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is what Ricardo taught us is decisive, right? And I'll show you the example in a second. It's trivial, but a lot of people still don't get it, you know? And that's, it's a shame. You know, you need to understand that, and you also need to go the next step and say, okay, we can all gain by specializing, but we need to make sure that we can sustain it so we can continue to specialize and not have a war with each other and lose all our valuable production because we decided to specialize. And also you need to remember to compensate the losers. Right? So that's really kind of important. I'm going to talk about this one mostly for the rest of the course, which means trying to use our imbalance in allocation of factors to our mutual advantage. So factor proportions theory I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that. It's very important for the next couple of lectures. It means that regions that are capital intensive will tend to produce capital intensive goods relative to capital non-intensive goods. And if you have lots of labor relative to capital, like Poland relative to Finland, you're going to specialize in labor intensive. It doesn't mean completely, but it means you're going to put more of your factors in that area. Okay, we'll see that. The final one is to me, one of the most interesting future references of where trade is going, which means that countries, regions tend to export and import the same stuff. So Berlin has Prussia, Brandenburg has a trade balance with Bavaria. We don't know exactly because no one writes it down, but Bavaria exports beer to Prussia, to Brandenburg, and Brandenburg exports a little bit of beer. And crazily enough, there are people in Bavaria who actually drink beer from Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, okay? So why, you know? Beer is beer. No, wine is not wine. Rheinhessen exports wine to France. I learned that a couple of weeks ago, okay? Germans obviously like French wine, but there's intra-industry trade. So that's another aspect of trade that we have to think about. Specialization, product differentiation. Those are kind of interesting mutual concepts You produce specialized goods that are so special that people are willing to pay extra, for a bike that comes from France, but there are French people who would have a bicycle that comes from Germany. Crazy, right? Okay, so let's briefly talk about Ricardian trade, just to remind you, it's all about costs. Ricardo, genius that he was, and if you took my macro course, he talked about state budget, deficits, and surpluses, borrowing. He talked about everything. His big thing was comparative advantage international trade. Productivity and therefore costs are decisive for Ricardo. Countries shouldn't produce everything. They should specialize in the things they do relatively the best relative to the other countries. So that's what we call comparative advantage. And I'll give you the demonstration in a second. Now, we do think this is important. This is not going to be an engine for integration for us. This is not going to be an integration engine. Okay, so this is more something we observe with really super developing countries in real disadvantage where they don't even have the technology. Okay, they're maybe exporting raw materials, et cetera. It's still relevant. Okay, but I'm gonna just remind you what it is. So Ricardo talked about two goods, wine and cloth, and he talked about two countries, Portugal and the UK, or England. Okay, so in this model, there's only one factor of production, it's labor. And all that Ricardo wrote down in his fantastic exercise was just the amount of labor we need to produce 1 unit of each of these goods. Okay, so to produce 1 unit of wine, Portugal needs 2 people, and England only requires 1. Cloth, Portugal requires 3 people to produce 1 unit of cloth, and England requires 1. So if you look at this, it looks like England is just dominating everything because they're more efficient in both, right? They only need one unit of labor to do both. But it turns out, and this is one way of motivating, you can say, okay, what would happen if we specialized? Okay, suppose each country has 100 units of labor that can't move between countries. Okay, so Portugal could produce 50 units of wine, and England could produce 100 units of wine with that 100 units of labor, equal size. England could produce 100 units of cloth, Portugal could only produce 33 units of cloth. So how would you go about allocating the labor within countries? You can't move it across borders. We don't have the labor mobility anymore. How would you do it? Well, you can say, okay, let's have autarky. Let's just split it. Let's try that. Okay, that's probably what it would look like if you put a border between Portugal and Britain, or you had a war between the two of them, they couldn't produce anything. Okay, that doesn't look bad. I mean, you can have some wine and you have some cloth, everything's great, hunky-dory. But it turns out that if you specialize, you can actually produce more as a sum. Remember, we're talking about the sum of the two regions, okay? And this is what we want, because then the relative price of wine for cloth or cloth for wine will lie between the two relative prices in the two respective regions. Okay, so the relative the price of cloth, you can show this formally as a result of trade. So somebody in Portugal has to offer some wine to the Brits for some cloth, and there's going to be some price that will sort of settle the demand and supply. And we're not going to specify that here, but it's been done many, many times. It makes more sense for Portugal to specialize completely in wine and then export whatever it needs to get the cloth it needs from the UK. Okay, so this is, now do you see any problems with this? I mean, I think a lot of people see problems with this. This is a brilliant idea, but it has problems. Well, I have one up here. One problem is up here. If the poor people working in the cloth industry in Portugal cared about their jobs, whoop, it's all gone. They better move to the wine sector. And we're just going to ignore that. And that's kind of not a good idea, because those people are the ones that vote for the putting up the trade barriers. Okay, you get it? What else? What other kind of problems would you have? Well, maybe there's rough seas between Britain and Portugal. You know, maybe there's going to be a storm and the ships sink and you have no clothes. Right? So maybe there's some security issues. You can't, you know, this is a relevant problem nowadays. If you have a plague, if you have a pandemic, you may not get the stuff that you didn't specialize in. So there's some risk involved. Still, it is a driver for international trade. No question about it. Did you have a question? Somebody have a question? Okay. All right. So this is, it's an easy no-brainer to understand, and you know, even though England is more efficient in absolute terms, it still makes sense for them to specialize. So some middling way, some compromise between the, you know, autarky and specialization will make people better off, no question about it. Okay, and we see that. We especially see that if we have stable borders, stable trading relations, if you can count on England and Portugal being willing to trade tomorrow. That's the key thing, right? So the security issue is important. I'm going to talk more about the second type of trade, hexaolene trade, factor proportions. So it has to do with the relative intensity of the endowment of capital and labor in the two regions. We're still talking about, take Poland and Finland integrating. The picture that you looked at for many hours has Poland being labor intensive and Finland being capital intensive. It's going to be the same idea. You want to specialize relatively to the other good in the good that is labor intensive if you have lots of labor. And if you have lots of capital, you specialize in the good that's relatively capital intensive. Okay? The third type I told you about already. Why does Germany export wine to France? It does. It's a fact. And why does French? I mean, if you go to places in West Germany, you can buy 1664, which is a terrible French beer. No one's going to watch this YouTube video, so who cares? It's just, but people like it. There are people who like it, and they're willing to pay and import that stuff. Why would you buy Bud Light? You can buy that in Germany too, right? So, I mean, people are willing to pay for this variety. It's called love of variety trade. So in this model, which we won't talk about, but if you took the trade course, you would talk about it. The love of variety means that on some days you actually want to have some goods that aren't likely to appear in the usual stereotypes, right? So you will want to buy, bicycles from Finland, or buy wine from Bulgaria or something. So you have this love for variety, and that leads to trade that is bidirectional. So we call it intra-industry trade. The greatest example, of course, is French cheese, right? The Danes make a cheese, the French eat it, even though the French have 400 different varieties of cheese. Okay, you had a question?
Isn't the biggest export into industry dangerous by itself? So when Darwin needs a factory for, rather than for windshields, and BMW is one too, and then there's a third exporter.
Absolutely, right. So trade in inputs is a great example of this type of love of variety. We'd have to extend our heads a little bit, and it's not about the consumer anymore, it's about the producer. The producer needs products that are produced in different regions, and there's specialization, usually because there's some fixed input like expertise, like machine tools. The Germans are very good at it, but there are also some good Czech machine tool companies, and sometimes you put them together, so you have these complementarity. So that trade is very difficult to understand. It's hard to put that kind of trade in a factor endowment framework. And it turns out that kind of trade can actually drive things apart. Because if you have bad luck, if your brand goes down the drain and people don't want to buy it anymore for whatever reason, that can really hurt you. It has nothing to do with your factor endowments. It can actually drive wages apart and lead to divergence. Okay? It's a great point. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this one. I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about this. relative factor abundance. So the angle in the Edgeworth box is decisive, right? Remember Finland had the steep one and Poland had the flat one from this perspective, right? And that's the relative factor endowment. So being off the diagonal means you can have this type of trade. You need two different production functions. So we need to think about that. We're going to consider the classic case. This is for you. You guys are bachelors. This is the basic stuff. Okay, if you like this stuff, you can do a PhD in international trade and go insane thinking about a whole spectrum of goods, infinite categorization and n-dimensional vector spaces, etc. We're going to do 2 by 2 by 2. So 2 goods, 2 factors, 2 regions. Really easy. And it's enough to give you the idea. And then you're good to go, okay? We're going to talk about a regular economy, so we're always going to have constant returns to scale, just to keep things straight. Because I know, you know, and I know, you know, I know, that constant returns to scale is an assumption. It's a good assumption as an approximation, but locally you might have increasing returns to scale, etc. Small country means price takers. So we're going to look at Poland and Finland integrating, even though the rest of the world is around them, determining world prices. So it's really a special case, and I'll give the specialness in a second. I'll show you the specialness. We're going to focus on the so-called integrated equilibrium. So we're going to look at ways that Poland and Finland, in this case, become integrated through trade based on their relative factor abundances. Okay? So again, we're trying to get trade to help us integrate better than just having an autarky situation. So to do this, we have to go through our basic micro. And I know you've all seen micro, and you probably love it. So I'm going to make you love it even more. So PPF, Production Possibilities Frontier, Isoquants, we talked about that already, and isocost curves, already mentioned it. You can do this very formally with lots of math. You can do it with pictures, figures. I like both because I think you can show the picture and then, that makes sense. And now I'm going to write down a formula or a mathematical problem that actually solves it. So start with isoquants and production possibility. We're talking about quantities, technical outcomes. So you could have a planned economy, you could have socialism, you could have markets. Basically, what can an economy do with the stuff it's got at its disposal? It's got capital, it's got labor, and it's got a production function. How much value added can it produce? But now we got 2 goods, not just one. So you can't just say, okay, here's a production function. You got 2 different production functions. You got production functions for good A and good B. Good A is going to be autos, and good B is going to be stuff, cloth, right? And then you can take a market perspective and say, okay, now I'm going to think about the cost of factors in a market where I have to pay labor and I have to pay capital to use it, and I have to produce at minimum cost so I can compete with my competitors across the street. What is the possibility of combinations of factor prices that are consistent with profit maximization, zero excess profits? Okay, so a lot of you may not be familiar with the isocost curve, and I think that's probably a good thing. So you'll have something to learn in this course, but we have to define it. So we'll start with the production function. Then we'll move to the isoquants, and then we'll talk about the PPF. So, isoquant. How much do I need to produce a set quantity of output? We've got the production function. How can I combine capital and labor to get that output? So if I have to produce 100 bottles of beer, how much capital, how much labor do I need? And you may laugh and say, oh, that's a crazy, crazy problem. But actually, there are capital and labor-intensive ways of producing beer. I mean, if I make beer in my bathtub, that's really labor-intensive, very little capital. If I go to, we took one of your classes to the Lech Brewery in Poznań, right? Poznan, lots of capital. Very few people, even in Poland, right? I mean, there were a lot of people putting the bottles in the cases, but the machines were putting the beer in the bottles. All right, so what combinations can we do? You can have high capital intensity. That would be a very steep K over L. See the little k there? Not an accident. That's the capital labor ratio. That isoquant gives the possibilities, that we can use capital and labor and combine to produce the fixed quantity of output. Here I'm talking about, I'm talking about beer, I'm talking about stuff, okay? Now, a lot of you may have forgotten the slope of that isoquant, you've forgotten it already, is the marginal rate of substitution of capital for labor, okay? That's the slope. It's actually the ratio of the marginal products of capital and labor at that point. Another fun fact, okay? So the marginal rate of substitution embodies the slope of the production function, the derivative of the production function with respect to its two factors. And if you just think about it, wow, that sounds interesting because the first derivative of the production function with respect to L is in a market economy would be the wage, and with respect to capital would be the return on capital. So that's the factor price ratio in a market outcome. But this is not a market outcome. This is just the technology. So economics is very good at separating the market, the belief in the market, from just the technology. You can be a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist and understand this curve, right? Because there's no market. It's just basically the technical substitution possibilities to produce this good using capital and labor. Now, a Marxist wouldn't even believe in this because they don't believe in production functions, but that's a different story, okay? Now, if you want to produce more of the stuff, what do you need? What's going to happen to the isoquant? Is that if I want to produce more than 100 units, what's the new isoquant going to look like? It should be above, because otherwise it wouldn't be an isoquant producing 100. If you want to produce more, if you want to produce 105, you're going to need more capital or more labor or both. Okay? And you could, by assumption, the production function will tell you what combinations are possible. If I want the higher level of QS3, I'm going to have more labor or more capital. Maybe I could have less capital, but I'm going to have a lot more labor. Okay? This is very abstract, but you're all smart Humboldt students, you get it, right? This is for stuff. But now the magic is I introduce a second good, and the second good does not have an isoquant that looks like that. It has a different isoquant. So now I add another good. Now I'm just saying, okay, now I'm going to vary the quantity of cars as well as the quantity of stuff. And remember, we only have a certain amount of labor in our region. We only have a certain amount of capital. So ultimately, we're going to have to allocate between the two. That's the whole point. But right now, we're talking about stuff and autos. Which one do you think is more capital intensive? Okay. Your intuition would tell you that. Can you tell us why that picture would show you that? Well, it's not shifting. It's a different object. It's like an elephant versus a giraffe. They're different. Okay, it lies to the left and above, right? Okay, but again, you can even compare the quantities, so it's not really a fair comparison. There is a way of making that assessment, though. You're right. Cars are capital intensive, but there's an ironclad way of showing it. And you had your hand up? Did you? It's okay. I mean, yeah. Yes, and that is what? Well, the capital labor ratio is the angle of that ray, whichever one you want to draw that starts at 0 and goes up there somewhere. Now, what am I comparing? See, I knew you would learn something today. Yeah. Yeah, it's still not quite fair because QS1 and QA1 are kind of different units. They're unit dependent, so it's not quite kosher because they're, what is a car? A car could be like a pallet of cars. It could be a truckload of cars. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So you could just take any K over L and just draw it to the extent that it actually intersects both of those and look at the slopes of each one of those isoquants. You'll always see that the car sector is steeper. Okay, that's one possibility. The one I like is this one. you basically just draw a common marginal rate of substitution and ask, okay, if we had the same marginal rate of substitution, what would be the capital labor ratio in the two sectors? And if you know that if we have constant returns to scale, these isoquants scale, they're homothetic. Homothetic. So they have the same slope as you move out from the origin. So look what I've done here. Common slope, and you can see that the tangency points are on a ray that go from the origin. And the ray has a steeper slope in the car sector, which is capital intensive. Just by inspection, you can see that it's steeper. Okay, so holding the marginal rate of substitution constant across the two sectors, which is a valid comparison. It's independent of how you define a car or a unit of stuff, right? So you basically keep that slope constant, and you move across the tangency points, you'll get two different rays, and by homotheticity, they will be rays, they will not be curved. Marginal rate of substitution will be constant as you're asked to produce more and more. The marginal rate of substitution at constant factor marginal rates of substitution will be rays from the origin. Okay, so that's I didn't use a single equation, but you can show that using an equation, right? It's about the ratio of the derivatives of production with respect to capital and labor at each one of those intersection points. Okay, so in a market economy, that marginal rate of substitution is actually going to be the ratio of factor prices. It's going to be the ratio of wage to profit rate or to the rental rate of capital. And there you can see when labor is expensive, firms move towards capital intensive uses. So if I just make that thing steeper, both sectors will try to use more capital relative to labor because labor is more expensive. That's the market logic, right? Similarly, if you move into a country where wages are low, this common wage rental ratio will fall, and both sectors will tilt towards more labor-intensive methods. Okay, and I haven't told you how much they produce. That's the market outcome, but this is the efficiency side of the story. Okay, so cars, autos, as Americans say, is more capital-intensive, and Stoff is more labor-intensive. So what do we see there? We see a kind of a parallelogram. We see two different capital labor ratios, and each one defines basically what a region could do. If they put all their workers in one sector, all their workers in the other sector, you can imagine that doesn't necessarily lead to full employment because the country may have lots of labor, and maybe they can't employ them all in the car sector. So it kind of gives you a sense where this is going. I'm not going to tell you yet how it ends up. Okay, we still need to find out where the prices are coming from. And I'm going to tell you very quickly, trading system, abundance of output, production versus demand. Demand reflects marginal rates of substitution. And therefore, you're going to have this, the world basically can produce, again, we're still in the world of QA and QS. QS is stuff, cloth, and QA is cars. If you think of all the labor available to this two-region trading area, this is what they could do, or the whole world, in fact, this is what they could do. And to find out what the world prices are going to be, you're going to have to find out what people want to pay for it. So indifference curves from microeconomics would tell you the willingness to pay for these goods. Okay, so we're free to draw the slope being very steep or very flat, depending on people's marginal rates of substitution. Okay, and the outcome would be simply a tangency point. So this is how Paul Samuelson sort of told us, this is how world prices get determined in a very simplified world. It depends on taste, and it depends on production possibilities. So Poland and Finland take that price as given. The ratio of the price of stuff to the price of autos is going to be the slope of this trading price, this trading line, or the price vector that comes out of trade, and that's a world price. And Poland and Finland will take that as given. Okay, so with that background, let's think about, and this is going to help us to think about the isocost curves in a second as well. Now let's think about the production possibilities frontier. Where does this thing come from, this curvy green curve? Where does that originate? It originates in the endowment of the region. Here, this is the world case, but if you think about Poland or Finland, it would be basically the labor and capital available. Okay, so let's try to motivate that using a little bit of math now. So I'm going to derive the PPF of a region, say Poland, and we need a production function. So I'm going to give you the easiest production function that students can understand. It's the Leontief production function. And Leontief got his PhD here, fun fact, in 1924. Fun fact. He did. Vasily Leontief. Okay, so does anybody remember what the Leontief production isoquant looks like? Looks like that, right? And that means basically, there's a minimum input you need of labor and capital, and if you don't have that, you can't produce the quantity, and everything else is überschüssig. It's really just unnecessary, right? So that's the production function. You can use the min function to get Q as a function of K and L, but you can also just use this, which is the converse of that, which is the unit labor and capital requirements to produce QA if you're talking about the cars, or QS if you're talking about the cloth. Okay, so to do this right, you need 4 coefficients. ALA is the amount of labor you need to produce 1 unit of cars, but you also got to have you have to have AKA units of capital. Okay? And similarly this is what I call the Marxist production function, because that's what Karl Marx thought. If you want to make cloth in England or pins or whatever they're making over there, you need so much capital and so much labor to produce every unit. No trade-off possible, no substitution. So we like to think of neoclassical economics as being an advancement on the view of technology. There is some substitution possible. It may not be perfect. It may not be like that, but it might be like that. Okay? It doesn't have to be like the L. L for Leontief. Right? Now, regions have endowments, so Poland has LA and LS labor, and LA and LS are how much they actually use to produce the labor and to produce cars or cloth. And K, same thing. But in a sense, those are outcomes, but you have to respect the total allocation. L bar and K bar are the labor and capital available to Poland, period. You can't cheat that. So if you plot these, this is how you get the PPF. First off, you just ask, okay, suppose I had all the labor I wanted. If I want to produce cars, how much labor do I need? So you can draw that steeper line, okay, and then you can draw the same thing for capital, and you have 2 lines. They express QA and QA respectively as a function of how much QS I'm producing. So you already got the sense of the PPF. So if I produce QS of the cloth, how much QA can I produce? Irrespective of the capital problem, right? Because I need capital and labor, and I need them in absolute minimum amounts. But if I had it lying around, what could I do? So the steeper one is the full employment condition for labor, and the flatter one is full employment condition for capital. You can write that down. You can see it's a function of the relative capital intensities. It's a function of AKS, AKA, and ALS and ALA. Okay, the problem with this is there's not abundant capital available to employ all the labor in the capital-intensive sector, right? There's just not enough there. So you have to take the minimum of the 2 to make feasible the fact that we need both capital and labor to produce cars or to produce stuff. So if I want to produce a lot of cars, I'm not going to be able to do it because I don't have enough capital. And if I want to produce a lot of stuff, I'm not going to have enough. I'm not going to have enough capital either, right? Because so in some sense, the green point is the only feasible combination that gives us full employment, and it's a solution of basically a linear combination of capital and labor requirements in the two sectors. And it's not an equilibrium, it's the full employment outcome. And that's going to be the green dot where those two full employment conditions intersect. Everything that's above that is not possible. Okay, so you can see that it looks like a PPF. It's got that sort of, it's piecewise linear, but it's concave to the origin. And that's the basic intuition behind any PPF. As you move, and again, what is the PPF? It's the most efficient way of putting our resources to work to produce QS and QA, given what we have. So if I tell you I have to produce under the dot, what is the maximum amount of QA I can produce? You just read it off the graph. And again, you have to be attentive to both factor allocations. So this is a really important concept. And understanding that means that we can go to the next stage, which is to understand what happens if you airlift, if you just drop some capital into Poland. Okay? Imagine that. It's kind of what capital mobility does. So suppose, a bunch of German companies just start throwing machines at Poland. What would happen in this picture? Which curve would shift? One of the curves would shift, for sure. And the math tells us which one. But you should also understand that only one curve shifts. The full employment condition for labor doesn't shift because we didn't airlift people into Poland. We airlifted capital. We dropped capital into Poland from the sky. So which curve is going to shift? Just look at the math. It's a simple linear equation. Which one has K in it? Which one has K bar in it? An exogenous increase in K is like increasing K bar. dk bar. So which one shifts? The flat one, exactly, right? So what do you think is going to happen? Well, the new full employment condition is to the northwest of the original one. And that's a really ironclad result, okay? And it also holds for many general cases. But for you, intuition, undergraduates, this is called the Rybczynski theorem. Increasing the capital endowment increases the output of the capital-intensive good absolutely, but it also reduces the output of the labor-intensive good absolutely. So by dropping this capital into Poland, you're not only expanding the Polish production of cars, you're shrinking, in a full employment situation, the output of cloth. That's called the Rybczynski theorem. It's fascinating, right? It's a full employment outcome. There may be some bumps along the way, but in the long run, it's going to look like that. So you actually contract the labor-intensive sector because you have to suck labor away from the labor-intensive sector to put them to work with all this abundant capital we've got. Okay? So this is a general result. So I can actually show this in a very general case. Okay, so the world trading system has given us a vector, a price vector, and the point that we choose on the PPF is basically the point where the marginal rate of transformation is equal to that price ratio. And if that price ratio is constant, and I dump a lot of capital in a country that has a smooth, non-Leontief production possibilities frontier, it's going to shift in a biased way towards capital-intensive output. And at constant relative prices for the output, this region is going to produce more of the capital-intensive good and less of the labor-intensive good. So that's what you want to remember, because that's going to explain a lot of things. It's going to explain why a lot of labor-intensive people get upset when there's FDI coming in and puts them out of a job, right? And they have to, if they were in the, it may be a job opportunity for them. You can go work for Tesla. You have to go through the retraining and everything else, but your old job is not going to be available, okay? So that's the Rybczynski theorem. Please remember that. Next week we'll use it or the week after next. We have the Irish friends coming next week. Please come, okay? Please show up. Tell your friends to come because I want them to think that we have a serious group of students who always come to lectures. Okay, so next time we'll do that. And then in 2 weeks, we'll talk about Rybczynski in detail. We'll talk about the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which does the same thing with respect to prices of capital and the price of labor, the factor prices. And then we talk about the integrated trade equilibrium. So how does this what's going to happen when we have Poland integrating with Finland and factor prices start to move? What is Poland going to end up doing? And what are they going to end up exporting? What are they going to end up importing? So you can probably imagine Poland will export the labor-intensive stuff and import the capital-intensive stuff. It's kind of a general idea, okay? We'll talk about some of the resistance to this. We'll talk about European integration. I think we'll hear from our Irish friends next week about that, and they'll tell you, they deal with this on a political level. Think about Ireland integrated with England. All of a sudden, England is no longer a trading partner. The UK is no longer a trading partner with Ireland. They were the majors league, much bigger than Germany, and then suddenly they face a common external tariff, and it's very difficult now to engage in the old this 15% external tariff is huge. It's a huge deal. And Japanese companies don't invest in the UK now because they don't want to deal with this anymore. They wanted to invest there because, and the United States wanted to invest because it gave them access to the EU. So all that stuff. And we'll talk about some of the failures of trade integration, and then we'll be done with trade as a block, okay? So please show up next week and have a nice week. See you later.